I was just talking before I actually started. So, um, but what the girl had said was, or the reporter, I don't want to misrepresent her, but what she had said was that the good news is that the United States has been very effective in reducing its CO2 emissions by moving from coal-fired power plants to natural gas, which frankly is a lie. I mean, and there's no other way to characterize it. Because first off, even if the United States has moved from some of its coal-fired plants to burning natural gas, they're still coal mining. So if you're still selling, because not only are those oil tankers that are running on those rails, but there's coal tankers running on those coal cars. There's still a tremendous amount of coal being extracted from coal mining. And it's being sold off to Europe. It's being sold off to Asia. So there is no reduction in total carbon footprint. The United States is exporting oil I mean, they're only rivaled by Saudi Arabia right now in terms of the amount of oil that's being exported. So even as anybody can make a claim that the electric power that produced in the United States may be a little cleaner because they've moved to natural gas, because that's a cheap, easy move, the amount of fossil fuels that are being extracted from the United States and sold elsewhere is actually much higher than it's ever been. So it is the idea that CNN would try to wrap up in a final note about almost 500,000 people showing up for a climate march with a comment like that. It just kind of goes to what is so problematic with the media, what is so problematic in the frankly what is fed to the American mindset. There was a book by James Lowen called "Lies My Teacher Told Me," and if you ever get a chance to check that out, it's kind of an interesting, easy read. And basically, the premise of the book is it talks about how high school and college history books, the inaccuracies of them, how things are characterized in a way that it almost says, here was the problem, but through American exceptionalism, we solved that problem and everything's better now. Like everything has a happy ending. And, one of the classics is talking about Helen Keller. Most of us, have this vision, and we're taught in grade school about Helen Keller and what a testament to perseverance, a child with such handicaps should have, and that she would not only become a scholar and a writer and just this highly educated woman from meager means and from just severe handicap. The interesting thing was, and there were presidents that weighed in. Presidents of the United States would sing the praises of the accomplishments of Helen Keller until she became an adult and actually started communicating things. And then Helen Keller became a devout socialist. She attributed almost all handicaps to either social class, because of either birth defects associated with poverty, or injuries because of unsafe workplaces. And so that's kind of what her premise was. So then you would have presidents of the United States and leaders of the United States. Well, you have to understand that she's handicapped. So it's like they would throw her back into some sort of characterization of, well, you have to understand where she comes from, and like make excuses for her like she's got diminished capacity to rationalize, the greatness of America or something. And that's what gets missed in a lot of the telling of history. We shape it and we turn it into these, tools of propaganda. And again, to listen to this, this reporter for CNN characterize the 500,000 people turning out, or almost 500,000 people turning out for a climate march, and saying the good news is, and because the problem is there's not that much good news. There are people, and I know mentioned Oren Lyons. There are people who've been around for a long time that have been addressing issues, and not just Native people. Plenty of people have been addressing these issues for a very, very long time. And you realize that we haven't even began to turn to right the ship, so to speak. We are still a long ways from that. There's some tough times coming, and and I don't say that to be a prophet of Armageddon or anything else, but it's unfortunate because we are being lulled into believing that somehow American exceptionalism will always prevail. And that's not as much an issue of race or skin color as it is about a philosophy that, finds its roots in Europe, and managed to create a hierarchy of thought and principle. I recently saw something that talked about how it is that the cartels of Mexico are not considered terrorist organizations, in spite of the death and destruction and some of that stuff. And there's a reason for that, because there's a fine line between the drug industry and American capitalism. And I think, I honestly believe that that's one of the main issues that separates the news and politicians and others from fully casting some of the worst human beings on the planet into being characterized as terrorists in that frame. And it's an interesting conversation. One of the things that I get into a little bit of trouble with sometimes, with even with not just my kids but grandkids, is they go to public school. So you're going to hear about Abe Lincoln and you're going to hear about George Washington, but from a Native perspective, there's a huge part of that story that's never told. George Washington, in the campaign against the Senecas, issued orders to General John Sullivan, and he basically ordered John Sullivan to inflict terror upon the Senecas. So the first use of that of terrorism in the as a military strategy came from George Washington, and that's documented. I mean, if you look up the Sullivan orders or the Sullivan expedition, it's right there in black and white. It says they would know the terror and the level of their chastisement is the expression that George Washington used. And he said, you will accept no pleas for peace. Your campaign is to inflict total ruinment upon the Seneca territories.
What led to that? Were the Seneca siding with the British at the time? Were they part of some kind of political situation?
Yeah, there were Seneca men. This was, I think this was, I want to say it was it was 1779 or something like that, I think, when the Seneca campaign, or perhaps a little later than that, at first was initiated. And what Washington said was that Senecas were producing a lot of food, and so the villages that they were raiding was not about going after the Seneca men, the Seneca warriors. Most of the Seneca warriors who were fulfilling their original relationships with Great Britain, and frankly were being treated better by Great Britain than the colonists, were at Fort Niagara. But the valleys of food production that were the Seneca villages, that's what Washington was going after. He said, we got to make sure that they can't feed themselves. So it was about imprisoning women, children, and destroying all of their, essentially the wealth that they had. In fact, there's an interesting story. The Senecas, Mohawk, we eat corn soup, and corn soup is made a certain way by using wood ash to break down the hulls of corn so you can separate it and make our soup. Well, after the Sullivan campaigns, so much of not just their fields, but their stores of food were torched, that the Senecas realized that they could find parched corn. And so what the Senecas, more so than the Mohawks have, they developed a roast corn soup. Well, they say it's roast, but it's actually comes from the Sullivan campaigns of burning their food. And so they were able to salvage so much of that corn that had been parched. And even many Senecas, I've got a lot of friends who spend a great deal of time making sure that people understand that even as you're eating this delicious soup, you should understand where its origins come from. We have a word for the President of the United States, and that word is called ranatagayas. Ranatagayas. You can actually look it up. It's kind of hard to spell, but if you look up town destroyer, yeah, a Google town destroyer, that's what ranatagayas means. It means town destroyer, and it comes from our description of George Washington. And again, we were talking earlier about how things kind of get lost in translation. So the word ranatagayas is a word that we use as our word for the President of the United States. I even, when Obama was elected, I said that it'll be interesting to see if the 44th President of the United States becomes the 44th ranatagayas, and it was a column that I'd written. But an interesting thing is that word, somewhere along the line, it became so familiar with associating it with the President of the United States. The Senecas, who have, unlike the Tonawanda Senecas, the Seneca Nation of Indians, which is where I live in the Cattaraugus territory, their president, they elect a president. At some point, the president of the Seneca Nation had a label, a plaque on the front of his desk, and it said, ranatagayas. And somebody said, do you understand what that means? He goes, yeah, it means president. No, it doesn't mean president. So this was a few years, this is about a decade ago, that somebody, one of the language folks said, that isn't the right word for you. But it's interesting how things, we skip a step when we end up using certain words about where it all comes from. The other interesting thing with Lincoln was that, and people don't realize this, but in January of 1863, when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a week before that, December 26th, 1862, was the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. It was at a place called Mankato, Minnesota. 38 Dakota were hung by the neck in this massive gallows that would hang all of them all at once. The execution order for that came from Abraham Lincoln. He signed it personally. There was 300 Lakota, Dakota half-breeds, if you will, that were tried for murder in a military tribunal, and they were tried as enemy combatants, if that doesn't all sound familiar, and they were all convicted to be executed. And Lincoln said, wait a second, I can't execute that many. Can't we trim the numbers down? He says, just send me all the ones who were also convicted of rape or mistreatment of women. And he said, well, we only had 2 that we brought charges of that against it. He said, well, send me the whole file. So Lincoln literally went through and just checked off the names of all the testimony that showed up the most and whittled the number down to 38. And so he signed the execution order. Now the rest of them all died in prison. So they weren't, they just weren't executed at Mankato, Minnesota. But that's the day after Christmas. And it's the funny thing is, the images of that. This was captured in paintings, and in fact, there was a beverage company in Minnesota that did these commemorative beer trays, and you can actually see you can buy online today, and it's an antique. It's worth a lot of money. A beer tray with Mankato, the hangings of Mankato, Minnesota, depicted on a beer tray.
Is it depicted in what kind of emotions connected to that?
Oh, it's got the fine people of Mankato, Minnesota. And even though it's December 26th, can you imagine what that weather must have really been like? But they're out in their finery, bringing their kids to a good old-fashioned Indian hanging.
So it's a celebration.
It's a celebration, yeah. So it's not depicted as a tragedy. It's depicted as a celebration. And part of that whole, what they were tried for was for raiding villages, because earlier that same year, Lincoln had signed the Homestead Act, which had white settlers going into Lakota, Dakota territory, basically pushing Native people out from their homes, and they never paid them for it. So not only the financial payments, but the payments that were supposed to come in terms of food and all that other stuff never came. So, but Lincoln had some other things going on at the time. So what the mess that he caused for the Lakota wasn't high on his priority list. Look, I'll get started. Even though it sounds like I got started. Before I even get into too much of an introduction, one of the things that we do in our culture is a thing, we call it the Ohunda Guriwadekwa. And what that kind of loosely translates to is the words we say before all else. And some people will call it the opening. The Senecas actually have a word, and I'm not even sure what the word means, but it's called Ganunyuk. But some people call it an opening prayer or the opening. But what it is, and what it's really geared towards, is understanding that when you come together, the first thing we should try to do is bring our minds to a place where we agree upon, where a certain foundation is laid. So in order for us to leave here with the best possible outcome for why we've gathered, that we come into the conversation, we come into the event with a good frame of mind. So I'm going to do, and I wrote this up specifically. This is some people treat this almost as a standardized list of the things that you acknowledge. As a Mohawk, as a Gunyagahaga, we don't do it ritualistically. We actually tailor the opening. We tailor the Ohundaguri Wadekwa to the event oftentimes. So when you hear a Mohawk do the Ohundaguri Wadekwa, it oftentimes will sound more like a conversation than a recitation. So I drafted this from my own shortened versions of what an opening would be like to where it would be a little bit more understanding for what we're here for. Ohundaguri Watekwa, the words before all else. Anytime we gather, it is important that more than just our bodies have come together. Gathering our minds is equally important. Before we begin a meeting of important work or a celebration of an event or an honored occasion, we do so in the hope that we will leave such a gathering with a good mind and lifted spirits. It has been our custom to begin a gathering by reminding ourselves of our relationships and the things we are grateful for, to make a special acknowledgement of these things. So before we attempt to gather our minds around a particular subject or event, we say words to lay a foundation of acknowledgement of our relationships and bring our minds together as one on many things we take for granted, yet can easily agree upon. The people. Today we have gathered, and in doing so, we see that the cycles of life continues. As a creature gifted with the power of reason, choice, and deep thought, it is easy to forget what we call our original instructions. Our first and most sacred covenant is with nature, and the evidence of the power of creation. We have been given the duty of living with skana. This word is often described as peace, but it is more than that. It is balance and harmony, and it is with responsibility. So we first acknowledge each other. We welcome each other. We show gratitude for everyone who has joined us. We are glad that their journeys have delivered them safely, and we wish the same for their travels home. We know some who would like to be here may not have been able to join us, and that many of us have families at home, perhaps near or in faraway places. We wish them well and hope that the presence of those here will bring some benefit to those not with us now. We know that many of us have children, sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, some not even born yet, that we have tremendous responsibilities to. We hope that the time we take here away from them will be worthwhile to them as well. We know that many of us here not only have traveled here, but come from diverse backgrounds and join us with unique experiences, beliefs, and customs. So we now bring our minds together as one as we give thanks and greetings to each other as people. Now our minds are one. The earth, our mother. We are thankful for our mother, the earth, for it is our mother that sustains us, nurtures us, and provides all we need for life. She provides the very ground, the foundation that we walk upon as we make our lives upon her. She provides the mountains and the meadows, the valleys and the marshes. She gives us the sand, the rock, the rich soils. She has the forests, the plains, and the canyons, as well as islands, great and small. The earth is balanced and is alive with systems that cleanse and renew. Her cycles continue daily, monthly, yearly, as well as through the generations and the millennia. The earth fulfills her responsibility as she has always done, never failing in her obligations to us and all of creation. She teaches us about generosity and consequences. She provides beauty and inspiration. And when each of us have lived all of our days, she takes us back. It gives us great joy that she continues to care for us as she has from the beginning of time. And so we give thanks and greeting to our mother, the earth. Now our minds are one. The waters. We give thanks to all the waters of the world. Water is the source of life and is life. It quenches our thirst and runs through our bodies. Water gives us strength. It cleanses us. It helps us maintain our health. It is our first environment within the womb and forever remains a part of our daily life. Water provides us with a mode of transportation. It provides recreation. It is the home of an entire other world of life. Waters are the home to life within the water itself, at its surface, and at its water's edges and coasts. Water is all around us. We see it in the rivers and streams, the ponds and the lakes. We see it in the rains and the pools on the ground. We see it in our tears and with the birth of our children. We know the power of the waterfalls and the vastness of the great oceans, as well as the quiet fog, the gentle mist, and the invisible dew from nightfall. We see it in the ice and snow, as well as the great glaciers and frozen lands at the poles of our mother. The rains clean our air and the land. It waters our crops and colors our world with white and black clouds, brilliant sunrises and sunsets, rainbows, and of course the greens and blues that only water can produce. We know water is precious, and we acknowledge and give thanks and offer greetings to the water. Now our minds are one. The fish. We turn our minds to all the fish and other life in the water. The fish have an important responsibility to the water. They clean and purify the waters and are a diverse and important part of the food chain. The fish and water life range from the oxygen-producing plankton to the great sea creatures and the largest animals on earth. The fish provide an important part of the diets of people as well as much of creation. It is the fish and water life that began life on our mother. It is from this life that all life sprang. We have a responsibility to the fish and the water life, and it is one we must not take lightly. If our waters struggle with sustaining the life within it, then all of creation is at risk. So we turn to our cousins, the fish, and we give thanks for all they do. We acknowledge them and send our greetings to them. Now our minds are one. The plants. Now we turn to the vast and immense fields of plant life. For as far as the eye can see, in incredible places all over the planet, the plants grow. They provide the very air we breathe and sustain an amazing range of life forms. The plants work incredible wonders from enriching the soil to breaking down the most powerful rock and stone formations. The plants have been at this work for millions of years and have helped prepare our mother for the life she now sustains. The plants are at the foundation of the cycles of life, both providing life and living off other creatures. The plants provide fragrance and beauty. They inspire us and mark our memories. They help chart the seasons and draw much of creation to them. They provide food, home, shelter to vast numbers of animals and insects. They provide materials for homes, clothing, and so much more. We walk and rest upon them. They never stop their cycle of growth, air cleansing, and soil work. With our minds gathered together here, we give thanks and look forward to seeing the plant life for all the generations to come. Now our minds are one. The food plants. Where the minds gather, we turn our attention to acknowledge the food plants. The first of these plants to bear fruit is the strawberry, and we give special thanks to the strawberry for leading the way and letting all of us who enjoy this precious food know that this yearly cycle is continuing. The strawberry is followed by many other berries, greens, roots, nuts, fruit, and seeds that nature provides all on its own. Beyond the food plants that provide the food we gather are those we cultivate and nurture like our daughters. Among these are the corn, beans, and squash. We call these the three younger sisters because we prepare a place for them, we care for them, we watch over them until they mature into their fullest potential. When we place those seeds in the ground, there is no greater show of our faith in creation. And it is with both our faith in the food plants and the work of our hands that we realize a harvest and sustain life. Of course, these food plants provide food to more than just us. Many plants are food plants for other creatures. We all draw strength and nourishment from these plants, for they are at the foundation of all diet. Creation provides this for us and does so willingly and reliably. So with our minds on food plants, let us give thanks and appreciation to the food plants. Now our minds are one. The medicine plants. Of the vast plant life, there are those that are medicine plants. Creation gave a specific purpose and a set of instruction to these plants to heal injuries and drive out sickness. The medicine plants lie waiting to heal us and many other creatures. We learned of many of their healing properties from observing our animal relatives. These medicine plants never waver in their commitment to heal and push away sickness. We are happy there are still among us those special few who remember these plants and who know how to use and administer their healing properties. We are grateful to those that gather the medicine plants so that they are not overpicked or abused. With one mind, we send greetings and thanks to the medicine plants and to the keepers of the medicines. Now our minds are one. We now turn our thoughts to the trees, the largest and strongest of the plants. The trees dominate our mother in scale and variety. The many families of trees are as vast as their purpose and original instructions. Trees are both food plants and medicine plants. They provide homes and shelter for ourselves and all of our relatives. The trees cool us with their shade and warm us with their source of fuel for our fires. That fire is the symbol of our family, of our counsel, and our power of gathering our minds. We owe our fire to the trees. We drink of their sap, make medicine and sugar from it as well. We make medicine from their leaves, their bark, and their roots. We eat their nuts and their fruit. We build our homes of them. We build tools, weapons, baskets, canoes, snow snakes, lacrosse sticks from them. We make music from them with drums, rattles, the flute, and the whistle. They make nature's music on their own, with the wind through their leaves and whistling through their branches. The trees purify the air we breathe and provide fragrances, I'm having a hard time with that word, fragrances, and blossoms for our senses. The tree is a symbol of strength and peace. Trees are a source of beauty and inspiration, whether through their leaves of green, their colors of fall, the snow-packed branches, or glimmering ice-encased branches of the winter. Their beauty and strength challenge our imaginations as they teem with life in all shapes and sizes. We give respect and reverence to the tree life and offer our thanks and greetings. Now our minds are one. The animals. We gather our minds and send greetings and thanks to our cousins, the animals. Our animal relatives teach us many things. They show us survival skills and life lessons. They entertain us, feed us, shelter us. They are the symbol of our clans and teach us grace, dignity, and patience. From the smallest mouse to the most powerful bear, we learn from them about family, teaching our young, diet, medicines, and responsibility. We see them near our homes and deep in the forest. We see the night creatures and those that change their appearances with the seasons. We are glad to see them and know that we share the same mother. We have them in our stories that remain as true today as when our grandfathers learned and told them. We look forward to learning from them and hope it will always be this way. So let us offer thanks and greetings to our cousins, the animals. Now our minds are one. The birds. At this time, we give our respect to all birds, our winged cousins. With their flight, they symbolize freedom and defy what binds most of us to only ground or water. They remind us to enjoy and appreciate life. Their beauty of flight inspires us and takes our imagination to new heights. Their songs treat our ears, and the beauty of their feathers catch our eyes. While their eyes cry and warn us, their eyes cry and cries warn us, their songs soothe us, and their playfulness entertains us. Creation has made way for birds, great and small. The eagle is our symbol of vigilance for things to come, while the hummingbird is the whisperer and reminder of people and things that have gone by. The birds are cleaners of the cycle of life. They provide balance and give life to the skies. The birds are also in our stories and are also symbols of our clans. We use their feathers for ceremony and adornment. Birds are a source of food from their flesh to their eggs. They teach us of seasons, the weather, and migrations. We send a joyful greeting and thanks to our cousins, the birds. Now our minds are one. The four winds. We are all thankful to the powers we know as the four winds. We hear their voices in the moving air as they refresh us and purify the air we breathe. They show themselves in both gentle breezes and powerful storms. They help bring in the changing seasons and changing weather. From the four directions they come, with warmth from the southern winds and tropical storms as well. From the north, we get cool breezes of summer and fall and the Arctic blasts of the winter. From the east, we get the sea breezes. And from the west comes most of our regular weather patterns. The four winds sweep our lands and push our clouds and cast the leaves and seeds to keep our cycle of life in motion. With one mind, we acknowledge the four winds and offer our greetings and thanks to the four winds. Now our minds are one. The thunder beings. Now we turn to the west. It is from the west that we associate the thunder. We call the thunder beings our grandfathers. With the awe-inspiring lightning and powerful voice of thunder, they usher out winter and announce the coming of spring. The intimidating sight and sounds of the thunder beings keep our young close to us and teach them of the power of nature. They bring us the ground-soaking rains that swell the rivers and streams, pushing out the ice and moving trees and rocks and gravel to the riverbanks and out to sea. The lightning charges the ground, releasing energy from the powers of our grandfathers to the necessary processes of earth. We celebrate the spring appearance of the thunder beings and again acknowledge the continuing cycles of creation. So let us now give respect to our grandfathers, the thunder beings, with thanks and greetings. Now our minds are one. The sun. We now send greetings and thanks to our eldest brother, the sun. We call him the ultimate warrior, for each day without fail he travels the sky from east to west, bringing the light of a new day. It is through light that wisdom is obtained. By shining his light, the knowable is revealed. Our eldest brother provides warmth and protection. He is the fire of all fires and is the fire of life. There is never a day that the sun fails to stretch across our sky, and it is the sun's power that wakes up the plants and the animals. It is the sun's power that warms our water and has its energy stored in all plants, including our food plants, our medicine plants, and the trees. Our eldest brother travels from east to west each day, revealing the paths of our ancestors and lighting our way. The sun is our most precious source of energy and light, and it is with deep reverence that we honor the ultimate warrior, the eldest brother, the sun. We give thanks and greeting to the sun. Now our minds are one. The moon. Where the minds gathered, we give thanks to our grandmother, the moon, who lights our nighttime sky. She is the grandmother to the world. She moves the ocean tides and marks time off in our yearly journey. The moon is connected to all women of the world. The changing faces of the moon marks the cycles of women and our mother the earth. The birth of our children are measured against her face. We plant by her, we travel by her. She too reveals wisdom with her light and shows special lessons that only can be learned in subdued, moonlit nights. She fills our stories and inspires our gazes into the nighttime skies. So let us give thanks and greetings to our grandmother, the moon. Now our minds are one. The stars. We now acknowledge our most distant cousins, the stars, who are spread across the nighttime sky like jewelry. We see these distant relatives in the night sky helping our grandmother, the moon, light the darkness. The stars offer guidance for travel and inspiration to dreamers. It is with stars that the kiss of the evening's dew quenches our mother's thirst. Stars give us hope, peace, and tranquility. We see images in the stars. Those images are part of our stories. The stars are humbling. It is almost impossible to maintain arrogance in the face of a star-bright night. So let us take time to give a special greeting and thanks to our most distant cousins, the stars. Now our minds are one. The enlightened ones. There are teachers who have come throughout the ages to bring us to the places to receive knowledge. These are the ones who help restore balance through counsel, advice, and listening. These enlightened ones are aware and more easily acknowledge our connectedness. The enlightened ones do not teach us to live the old ways. They bring them forward, not us backwards. They promote living in the present with respect for the past and responsibility to the future. The great mystery is not a test or a challenge. It is an acknowledgement that some things are simply unknowable. We need the enlightened ones. More than ever. So let us give thanks and express our appreciation for those that lead us to wisdom and knowledge. Now our minds are one. Creation. This time and every day, we need to acknowledge the power of creation. We are told that we will not know the face of that power or where it dwells. We'll only know the evidence of that power, creation. We call the power of creation the great mystery. We tell creation stories to teach about creation, not to explain it. What we do know is that creation is complete and continues every day. No needs are left unmet. We have been provided with everything we need for a prosperous living. We all are. But creation is not for us alone. When we speak of keeping in mind the 7 generations, it is not just our line that is to be considered. We speak of responsibility to those faces we'll never see, but it's not just our faces, the human face. It is the face of the wolf and the polar bear. It is the face of the fatherless child growing up in a tough neighborhood and the eagle's egg impacted by a damaged river. Creation is obvious. It is all around us. There's no mystery involved in acknowledging creation. It is about respecting relationships. It is not about tolerance, but acceptance and respect. So let us acknowledge creation. Let us appreciate not just each other, but all of our relations. Creation is everyone and everything. So let's learn about those relationships. Let's give thanks and respect to creation. Now our minds are one. No thanksgiving can ever be complete. We give thanks and acknowledge all that we can, but even with the best of intentions, we are bound to miss things. While we have many shared experiences, our views and perspectives make our experiences different. As we gather together, we come from homes from very different places. It is for these reasons that we take time and offer a moment for everyone to add your own acknowledgement and offer our thanks and greetings in your own special way. and now our minds are one. This is a familiar type of opening that we do. And I do it here now because on the with the original request to come speak with you, it was talked about trying to understand Native spirituality. And when I first spoke to my wife about the email, she said, "Well, you're not much of a holy man," and it's true that I'm not. And I said, "But that's the point." And what has happened with our culture, with our teachings, with our stories, is that they've been co-opted, oftentimes almost as a means for survival, but certainly as a way, well, again, to survive, but also as a way to validate them, I guess. When you hear of our stories, and you can see sometimes that they have a familiar ring to them, that they seem to line up with a parable from the Bible, or they line up, and the likelihood that they just coincidentally lined up is pretty unreasonable, I guess. So what happens is, we have stories that we tell, and as I said in the opening, we have stories that we tell that help our children understand the things that they will face. They are not our history, even our creation story. And frankly, you'll have some others that could stand at this podium and tell you otherwise. But our creation story is not a history. Frankly, it'd be kind of impossible to have a creation story be a history, because who would...
Can you share the creation story?
I will a little bit, because who would have been around to tell it? Because when we talk about our creation story, it refers to, it never really talks about a very beginning. It really refers to a sky woman, a woman who lives in a sky world, who falls through a hole in the sky and finds herself on the back of a great turtle. And it ties into us referring to this continent as Turtle Island. And in landing on the turtle, as she goes from Sky World, she is clinging and she grabs on to various roots and herbs, tobacco and a few other plants. And again, this symbolism. And she goes into a water world, and again is captured, or finds herself on the back of a turtle. This creation story is essentially a metaphor for childbirth as much as anything. And that gets missed in a lot of its telling, because in telling the story in the way that I learned it, it would teach you something about birth, about the birth of man, not just about where we come from, as far as almost where we come from as individuals, not as a species. In this creation story exists before we had language, before we had so much of these things. So obviously there would have been no way to communicate the story. So this is why I say the story was meant as a means to prepare our young people to understand various concepts that they would come to know as they grew, which is most of what we do. Even our ceremonies. Our ceremonies, and we call them ceremonies, but we also, in our language, the words translate more to either a thanksgiving or a festival, a joyous occasion. They were never meant to be these ritualistic, religious practices. There's dance, there's music, there's food, there's socializing, that's what every one of our 9 major ceremonies are. And we do these things to not only uplift our spirits, but we use every one of these things as a teachable moment. The very act of burning tobacco. There are some that'll tell you, with this tobacco, we can speak our words to this tobacco, and the tobacco smoke will carry our words to the Creator. That power of creation is around us at all places, and it doesn't need a specific device to carry our words. But we do that because every one of those is a teachable moment. When we do that opening, if we start our day with that, it doesn't make sense. It makes some sense to do it all by yourself, but it makes more sense to do it amongst others. So you remind ourselves. It's all about relationships. And as human beings, one of our most important relationships are the relationships we have with those that are coming up behind us, our young, our children, our grandchildren. I stand here before you as a grandfather. I've raised 3 children. I have 6 grandchildren right now. I have twin boys that are due this summer, and my 9th grandchild is due later on, closer to winter. So as I stand here, if I'm invited back a year from now, I will have 9 grandchildren, and the thing about being a grandfather is it is not something you plan. You may plan your children, you may plan the growth of your family, but you don't plan for the growth of your grandchildren. And my oldest grandson is 11 years old, and I have a 2-year-old that'll turn 3 at the end of the month. The only 2 granddaughters I have right now were actually born on the same day, not just the same calendar day, but the same actual day. Yesterday was the 6th birthday of both of my granddaughters, Julia and Rael. Their names are Ozi Stanuru and Ozi Zadagan. Ozi Zadagan means a bursting flower, and Ozi Stanuru means a precious star. And that's the 2 names of my granddaughters. The rest are all boys, and they keep me busy. But the key with a lot of the things that we do, the ceremony, the stories, they are not meant to be a plea for help. We don't do a ceremony because we're asking more of creation. We do a ceremony because we're acknowledging that creation has done enough, and continues to do all that it was ever asked to do. And that is sometimes the difference. So when we talk about native spirituality, the biggest distinction that I see is in our people. In fact, the earliest travelers that came among our people, the overarching theme was the amazement that Europeans observed in a people that existed with social harmony, that prospered. It acknowledged that our culture acknowledged that we had choice, and that we had that all creation had choices, and although we were bound by certain what we call original instructions, and when we say that, it's easy to identify what we call original instructions in animals, because we always attribute it to instincts. Animals know certain things without being taught, and it's because they have it ingrained in their DNA. We do too. We just have had it clouded by several thousand years of reason, I guess. So we forget what those original instructions are. We challenge our own instincts for this kind of thing, and much to our own harm, I would say. So the biggest difference was that we acknowledged our relationships. We didn't view ourselves, we understood the distinction of all creation, including our own distinction. Obviously, we understood that we had a gift of language, and we had a gift of reason and thought, and much of that. But we didn't necessarily view ourselves as created in God's image, and that somehow we were placed here with a responsibility to subdue the earth, or to conquer, or or to reign or rule the planet. What we understood was relationships. We understood that there were consequences for our actions and that we had a responsibility. The whole idea that we always had to remind ourselves about the seven generations again was this idea that we had already lost some of what we would know by instinct to do. And what clouded our judgment was our ability for reason. So one of the main things that we use as a reminder is this concept of seven generations. And what that really means, because there are people who have different views of that even, and in fact other native cultures sometimes refer to the seventh generation as if there was only seven generations, and then some event would happen. And I don't challenge any of that, but within the Haudenosaunee culture, what we have is this awareness that the things that we do today will impact those voices and those faces we will never see. So why seven? Well, I stand here now with my family who can gather, and we can gather 5 generations of my family. I have that fortune, that good fortune to be able to have 5 generations, and my kids and my grandkids are a part of that. But it's pretty unusual to see 6, and almost unheard of to see 7. And frankly, by the time that you're the patriarch or matriarch of that 7th generation, you're probably going to have a really hard time knowing that 7th generation. But the fact of the matter is that there are choices that we make in our lives that'll impact those things. What's happened in much of organized or established or dominant religions is the sense of separating almost a responsibility to those that will live beyond when your life, whether you go to the afterlife or whatever. And you end up with this idea that the life here is a test to an afterlife. When the Mormons or the Seventh-day Adventists or the others would knock on my door and want to educate me, I would invite them in, and we would talk about afterlife. And I said, my afterlife is in the next room, or they're out there playing on that tree. And they said, well, what if you don't have a child? What if you don't have children? I says, then everybody that I've influenced in my life will carry a piece of, including you. Because I suspect you will remember the conversation we're having here today. And if you share it with someone, then I will have impacted your life. And so my impact on other lives becomes my afterlife. I said, I'm not going to debate your belief in heaven or hell or anything else, but I do know that I can create a world that punishes people, or I can help create a world that rewards people. And I would suggest, and I would submit that is my heaven or hell. And you can say these things, and just as I can say these things, that are pretty undeniable. So the whole idea, and when we would do this thing in the language, every time we would say that now our minds are one, we would get a response, and I wasn't expecting that from you guys, but we'd get a response. We would either say to or ya or huh. We would say, so it would be an acknowledgement that the things that I said found a home and they lodged themselves in each one of you. And that's what so that's what we would do. But we say these things because these are the things that we can agree upon. Because oftentimes this might be the words we say before we address a contentious issue. So if we can start from a place of wrapping our heads around the things that we can agree upon, that we can bring our minds together as one on these issues, the hope is that it'll be easier to bring our minds together on the issues that are before us. Now, I don't anticipate that I'm going to present anything that is of a terrible challenge to any of you here. I hope that it gives a thought or pause, and not to correct a way of thinking, but to open a way of thinking. And my job, or the work that I do, is not about judging somebody's belief systems or challenging them or correcting them, But again, what I try to do in the very work that I do, whether it's on radio or speaking or writing, is try to offer a perspective that perhaps hasn't been considered. You know, I get to come to New York every week and I do the show on WBAI, and the interaction that I get from the listening audience is pretty remarkable, and the diversity of that reaction. I mean, I'll get a call from, you know, the Italian guy from New Jersey, or from the, you know, the affluence of the Hamptons, or you know, I'll get a Jamaican woman to call, or, you know, one of the guys from Harlem, or, you know, somebody from Queens. I've had, you know, Muslims, Jews, Catholics, you know, all kinds of people that have called in. And a lot of times we're talking about environmental issues, social justice issues. And it's not a native show per se, but I'm a native host. Most of the people who listen to the show have heard me as I hosted First Voices Indigenous Radio for the last year. And so they know where I come from. A lot of my guests are guests that are around or on or about Indian country, but not always. And the topics that I try to bring up, I don't look for the things that everybody else is talking about. My wife asked me, geez, have you talked about Nepal? I said, everybody's pretty much handling that one. I said, I don't know that I have anything new to offer. Is it a tragedy? Absolutely. And is it something that we all need to be aware of? And I agree with her. But she sometimes gets puzzled at the things that I don't talk about. She doesn't disagree with the things I talk about. She just sometimes is puzzled at the things that I choose not to. And when I do talk about a subject, I try to talk about it in a way that's different. So when we talked, when I spent time on Eric Garner's death in Staten Island, it kind of came back not just about, you know, white police killing a black man. It wasn't just about that. It was about the whole idea that that the imposition of taxation, and not because I'm an advocate for cigarettes, but the idea that it was born out of being that over the top with trying to impose, you know, this taxation over tobacco. It was incredible. And I think so the conversation that I tried to have was to understand how you move away from the criminality or the criminalizing of individuals. And we face that ourselves as Native people. I think just yesterday, Canada passed Bill C-51, which is which is like the USA Patriot Act. It lowers the threshold for identifying and labeling somebody a terrorist. It offers more tools within law enforcement in Canada to do surveillance and apprehensions and that kind of thing. It most closely parallels the USA Patriot Act, but in many ways is worse. It makes it easier to label somebody a terrorist who may be protesting environmental issues, something that is a very common thing on the Canadian side. And frankly, it's a pretty common thing here as well. But we do face that issue. We face that issue in the United States as well as in Canada, because with those of us who are trying to fulfill the obligation to 7 generations, we find ourselves in conflict. How do we do that and not cross a line within the dominant culture around us in terms of what their laws and what their agendas are, what their philosophies are? You know, when the other thing that was so remarkable to the early observers of our culture was the lack of accumulation of wealth and possessions and objects that our people, and it's not because we didn't have them. We certainly made things. We certainly possessed things, but it wasn't an obsession, and it wasn't a measure of somebody's wealth or value to a society by what somebody could accumulate. Where somebody's stature was measured within our culture was what they could do for others, what they could give away. So it wasn't what you could accumulate; it is what you could give that was a measure of somebody's stature. And obviously, you would think, and in many ways, that does exist in other cultures. But when the American dream is pitched in the United States, it is pitched about this idea that if you work hard, that you can become wealthy. I mean, that's and you'll see the examples they put out there. They'll throw, and of course they'll throw a Oprah Winfrey out there. They'll throw out a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs or especially finding somebody of meager or humble beginnings, and they'll say, look how hard they worked and they made it. Not ever recognizing how many people work hard every single day to struggle. And the difference in our culture originally was this idea that you could not be successful if your neighbor wasn't successful either. And this isn't socialism and again, it's there's always a tendency, just like with Native spirituality, to box it in and to define it within somebody else's framework. So when I talk about a community succeeding or prosperity, you could not have a prosperous people if not everybody was prosperous. And so it wasn't socialism in the sense that many would think of it. That was a concept that was difficult. Much of Europe, long before they ever came to our shores, was really stratified in hierarchy, very much so, and it had been so for thousands of years. So the opportunity to do something new and different in when Europeans came to our homes, I think it was contemplated. I honestly do. I think that the early observation of seeing a people who could actually live in what many were describing as a utopian society was absolutely intriguing to some. But it was also very opportunistic to others. Christopher Columbus, when he first came to the islands, he saw, and he wrote it down, what a beautiful people that he saw, a generous people. And he described the physical beauty of both the men and the women. I mean, he wrote it in his journal. But he also said, the demeanor of these people is such that with 50 people, we could take over the entire land. With 50 trained soldiers, we could subdue all of these people. So even upon his marveling about the people and the beauty and the serenity and again, the prosperity of the people, he couldn't escape the opportunistic nature that came with the idea of domination. I will show a film, and hopefully we all we get it all. And what the film is, and the reason I chose to bring the film, not only because it's a great opportunity, it's a brand new film. It's in it is just now being released. In fact, I helped Stephen Newcomb, who is the producer of the film, come up with some of his final funding for his post-production in terms of getting clearances and that kind of thing, doing redoing even some of the audio. So what I have is a pre-release copy of this documentary, and it's about the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of Christian discovery. And the reason I bring it up is because when we talk about native spirituality, it's oftentimes difficult for people to understand how is it would be co-opted. How is it that it could be so influenced and changed? And frankly, when I hear Native people, especially Haudenosaunee people, because I can't judge other Native cultures, but when I hear Haudenosaunee people say things, sometimes I'm thinking, that isn't at all the way I learned it. Now, I can't say that they're wrong, but you can hear the ringing of the parallels of not just, predominantly Christianity. And you can hear it in almost every one of our stories, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But the reason I brought this document, it shows how dominant the church was in terms of establishing even law. The doctrine of Christian discovery was born out of the 15th century, originally with Portugal entering Western Africa, and in 1452, the Pope at the time basically suggested that not only was there a right but an obligation for Christian nations to vanquish pagan peoples and to reduce them to perpetual servitude and basically take their lands, and not to convert them. That's the other thing that sometimes gets lost. It wasn't about converting a non-believer to a believer. It was about spreading Christendom in the sense of spreading it over lands and spreading Christian domination over lands, not necessarily just converting people. Because even the converted, and you would see this in the United States, even through the slave trade, that kind of stuff. Being a Christian slave didn't make you any less a slave. So clearly, the conversion wasn't just the issue. But in these papal bulls that would come out in the 15th century, that would, again, starting with Africa, it made it very clear that a Christian nation, a Christian people, could legally do something that would, in all other societies, be considered illegal, which is to just take something, just have a legal right to take it. So that would also follow with Columbus's voyages, and in 1493, a papal bull was issued that actually drew some lines where Portugal and Spain could make claims based on people planting a flag on our lands. Now, when we consider that the United States claims to have a foundation in their Constitution that separates church and state, you would think, okay, well, why should that matter? The problem is the land title became established through these Vatican and these papal bulls. And even Britain, that had already was in the process of pulling away from the Catholic Church, would still adopt some of those same Christian-based decrees and land tenure laws. In 1823, this doctrine of Christian discovery becomes codified in U.S. law through the Johnson Court in a case, specific case called Johnson v. The Marshall Court, I'm sorry, in Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, and in the legal dicta associated with John Marshall's opinion expressed in those cases, he makes it very clear that sovereignty, and although that's not our word, that sovereignty did exist and freedom did exist for the people who lived here before discovery, but that sovereignty was necessarily diminished, is what he said. It was necessarily diminished, is what he said. And he basically said that once a Christian nation appeared on our shores, that our sovereignty was necessarily diminished. And then basically adopted the view and actually refined that view. And you'll see it in the documentary, so I won't do too much of it here, but we'll talk about it later. Basically that native people, because we were not Christians, did not have this, we did not have title to the land that we lived upon. That we were like the animals, because essentially that's what we were reduced to. And I don't even know if reduced is the right word, because I have too much respect for animals, but they basically said that we had a right of occupancy, that we were like the squirrels, we were like the raccoons or the deer, that we just lived there, that we didn't have enough awareness as a human being, because we weren't quite human enough. In the absence of Christianity, we weren't yet human, that we were more like the animals that just lived there. So what the church and what the courts recognized, that we had a right of occupancy, but we didn't really own the land. So regardless of how we felt about it. And the irony of that is, at the same time that courts are saying things like this, and that's 1823, if you go back, it's not even a generation, but if you go back to 1794, when the again, Rana Gaius, George Washington was negotiating treaties with the Six Nations. The language in those treaties said the United States recognizes that our land is indeed ours, and that the United States would never claim the same. I mean, it says it, that they will never claim the same until such a time that we would decide to sell it to them, which we have a right to do, sell, and they have a right to buy. And of course, much of those sales were fraud, but the fact of the matter is we still retain some of those lands. And today, the Haudenosaunee lands in quote-unquote New York State, we own those. They are not owned by the United States. They aren't owned by New York State. And the difficulty is, what happens is, because of the way the court systems work in the United States, when the challenges about things like jurisdiction or land use or land rights happens, there's never an acknowledgement of the very things that were said in these agreements. And a treaty, these treaties weren't giving us our land. They were acknowledging that the lands that we were retaining from the ones that we were giving, that the United States would never claim them. And yet, Johnson v. McIntosh, the doctrine of Christian discovery, these things would be imposed in courts almost out of context, and in such a way that we're still battling over jurisdictional issues on lands that are clearly ours, that the United States really to this day cannot say, well, yeah, you're on Indian reservation, but it's still in Erie County, or it's still in this. No, it's not. And we never get to that conversation again. But I think, and the reason I bring this stuff, and I think why it's relevant for this conversation, is you see that religion becomes a force of law, even in a country that claims the separation of church and state. And we can talk about even beyond the policies of extermination, the policies of assimilation that still meet the standards of genocide within the UN and international standards. We had 100 years of residential schools, boarding schools, that were imposed upon Native people. Not terribly far from here, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Carlisle Indian School. And when people think of Carlisle, they always think of one person. Is there any person that comes to mind when I say Carlisle Indian School? Of course, Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe was not from Pennsylvania, folks. He was Sac and Fox. But he was sent to Pennsylvania, and everybody knows who Jim Thorpe is. And by many standards, he's considered the greatest athlete of the United States, the greatest American athlete. Yeah, the problem was he was made into an American through this process. And I don't know, we all went to school. I don't know how many of us had schools with graveyards. Carlisle Indian School has a graveyard. We think of one person from Carlisle Indian School, Jim Thorpe. But you know, when you go there, there's a graveyard with 200 stones there. And those are the marked graves. About a half dozen of those say unknown. Can you imagine being in a school where you died, and when they planted you in the ground, they didn't know your name? In these schools, our people had their hair cut first, our names changed, and we were forbidden to speak our language, practice any of our culture. We literally had the Indian beaten out of us. In fact, the policy at Carlisle was kill the Indian, save the man. So when I get into my relatively heated discussions with some of these schools about them calling themselves the Conrad Redskins or the Lancaster Redskins or the Washington Redskins, and they say, oh, well, but we've had that name for 80 years. Yep, in fact, at the same time that you were taking this name on so a whole bunch of white people could play Indian, a whole bunch of Native kids, a bunch of brown kids were having it beaten out of them. They were having that language forbidden from them. They couldn't play Indian. They couldn't be Indian. In fact, there were some churches that believed the more Christianity you give a Native person, the whiter their skin will become. That's not really true, but if you keep us out of the sun, we'll light up a little bit. But that's the thing, and that's the thing that puts it into context. So when you wonder how does our spirituality become co-opted, that's how. It wasn't just through the residential schools, because it was before that. You know, the thing, there was um, within the Haudenosaunee, there are 50 titles that we call them titles. People call them 50 chiefs, but what they are, they're within our clan system. The Mohawks have 9 clans. It's actually there's 3 turtle, 3 wolf, and 3 bear. Same with Oneidas. So there's, they say 3 clans, but it's really like 9 titles, because they're like different turtle, different bear, different wolf. So what happens is, so we have 9 titles that are associated, 9 families with a clan mother and a what we call a Ruriano or Rurianisu, which people call chief. But it was a person that was given a responsibility. They were a servant of the people of that clan and then of their nation. So we have 9 of them within the Mohawks, 9 in the Oneidas. Altogether, there's 50 of them. One of those titles from the Senecas was called the Scunya de Rio. They called him Handsome Lake. One person that, who had that title becomes synonymous with that title, and people refer to him as Handsome Lake. And so what developed was what they call the Code of Handsome Lake. Now, the Code of Handsome Lake was a departure from many of our customs and traditions. It came in the wake of a very, very tough time for the Senecas. It was after the Sullivan campaigns. It was after, and in fact, it's not part of the Code of Handsome Lake and those people that would become pacified with this Quaker-influenced belief system was part of the reason that you would have the Senecas, who at one time were more aligned with the British, become very much aligned with the Americans by the time the War of 1812 would take place. And that's where Red Jacket would be awarded a medal from George Washington and that kind of thing. But in the Code of Handsome Lake, and Handsome Lake was an individual who, for one thing, was of the wrong clan to have been sat in that title. But regardless, things happen, and you make compromises to for a system to work. But Handsome Lake, who was the half brother of Corn Planter, another person that people may have heard that name, he, like many of that time, had a very severe drinking problem. So rather than somebody being removed from a title because of conduct, the system was already breaking down. Our system of Guyana Ragoa, what people call the Great Law of Peace, or the Great Good Way, the system that assembled through the peacemaker these 50 titles and our structure for counseling and all of these things that are so much integral of our culture. It had already broken down. Treaty making. When treaty making was done, it involved the requisition of rum. Barrels of rum. It was a tool. It was a device that was used in treaty making. So if you question how did lands get forfeited and sacrificed, well, the rum had a big part of that. Yeah, they drank, and it was very much encouraged. And of course, it wasn't just about drinking; it was about addiction. Alcoholism was imposed upon our people, and it was imposed at the highest levels. So Handsome Lake was a drunk, and he was a very, very severe drunk. He drank to the point where he went into an alcohol-induced coma, and it was in this period of time where people actually thought he died from alcohol that he awakened and spoke of the things he dreamed about while he was out. So the visions of Handsome Lake were visions that he had during this alcohol-induced coma, and from this time of essentially leaving his body for all intents and purposes, his family would interpret much of his dreams, and that's where what they call Gardiwillo or the Code of Handsome Lake was developed. And among, there were some very striking things about the Code of Handsome Lake. One is that rooting out witchcraft was a big part of that. That's not talked about much because frankly, there are people who are still very much follow this Code of Handsome Lake. I'm not one of them. It never had quite the same, became rooted quite as strongly within Mohawk people as it did amongst Onondagas and Senecas in particular.
Witchcraft?
Well, no, the Code of Handsome Lake. In fact, well, even witchcraft. I think witchcraft, the idea of witchcraft was really something that came with the same people who were promoting Christianity, because witchcraft was essentially represented the Antichrist. It was this evil blackness, and so in order to embrace the concept of witchcraft, you essentially were already embracing much of the concept of the righteousness of Christianity. So that's kind of where that whole conflict, even in Salem, where it came from. But the other thing that came from Handsome Lake's visions was he said he saw Daganowida. Now, Daganowida was, people call him the peacemaker. He was a Huron who helped reassemble, and not assemble, but reassemble the Five Nations, because this is before Tuscarora would join the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. He was a Huron. He knew of the Six Nations, and he knew of the conflict that was existing amongst the Six Nations. So when the Ganowida saw in his responsibility to try to convince the Six Nations, because if you couldn't convince the Six Nations to adopt a peace, then he viewed his own people and many Native people in general in strong jeopardy. He knew that there was a cultural integrity to the Six Nations that somehow was being ignored. So he came to the territory of the Five Nations. Eventually, he connected up with Hayawentha, and together they traveled the Five Nations, and they reaffirmed the relationship that we once had. But the Ganowida was a Huron. And the Ganowida, the word, his name means he has 2 rows of teeth. It wasn't actually his name, it's what he was referred to, because he actually had a bit of a speech impediment. And that's what Dega means, 2. The Ganowida, 2 rows of teeth. The reason he teamed up with somebody who was as charismatic as Hayawentha was because he knew that although the Ganowida was a great visionary, he was not a great communicator. So Hayawentha became his voice, so to speak. But what happens with, and of course, we don't have a date. There are some people who say, well, the Ganowida and Hayawentha, they existed in 15 such and such. I don't know. It was a long time ago. I don't think history is as relevant when people try to put a date to it, because especially when it comes to history that predates recorded history. I mean, for us, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So whether it was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, we just know from our oral tradition that we don't mark time the same way that Europeans did. So I still don't. But with Handsome Lake, with Cañar de Rio, he claimed that the Ganowida came to him in his visions. And in his visions, the Ganowida had holes in his hands and his feet. So clearly the implication, according to Handsome Lake, was that the Ganowida was Jesus Christ. Now, even devout Handsome Lake followers, they stop short of actually saying that, but that's where, again, the cultures become intermingled and co-opted. The story of the Ganowida himself, the important part of the Ganowida's work was the formation of the Guyana Goa, what people call the Great Law of Peace. But when people back the story up, they say, well, he was born of a virgin. And that although he didn't walk on water, he built a stone canoe to travel across Lake Ontario in a stone canoe. And that to convince the Mohawks of his righteousness, he climbed a tree and had them cut the tree off, and he'd go over a waterfall. So he basically had them kill him, and then he rose from the dead. So you have these stories, and I don't find the stories problematic, but they can take in many ways away from the significance of the actual work that's done. The idea that a man that would be called a peacemaker convinced at a very tumultuous time people to once again revisit peace, and it took a long time. He didn't do this overnight. Was astounding. And was he a prophet? Was he sent by the Creator? Or was he just a visionary? Because I think we've had them. We've all had them. We've seen them in Martin Luther King. We've seen them in some, in many people along the way. We've seen people that may have been flawed character on some levels, but knew how to inspire people to return to a place that creation probably wanted them at in the first place. That's what I envision in the Ganawida. And in Handsome Lake, what there was an individual who was very, very troubled, and because of Quaker influence thought maybe it's going to be easier for us to survive if we adopt some principles that are more familiar to the dominant culture. And so he did. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson spoke of the Code of Handsome Lake, and he said, this is a good thing. It seems like we left a pretty good mess with the Senecas, and they're finding something to find inspiration around. The crazy part for me is when I consider, again, even though I say I try not to get hung up on dates, but you look at the overlay of time. At the heyday of the Code of Handsome Lake spreading as a religion, and it had some very specific tenets to it, but it spread as a religion. It condemned music, it condemned gaming, gambling, because they saw that our people it condemned drinking. It condemned the very things that Handsome Lake knew were a problem. It condemned drinking, it condemned partying. It said music, but it was mostly referring to fiddle music, because fiddle music seemed like it was associated with drinking. It wasn't, it was like, sex, drugs, rock and roll, exactly. It was the rock and roll of the era. And of course, gambling, it was referring to the fact that there were people who would swindle people in gambling. Within our culture, we had games of chance. We have the peach stone game, which is a part of our major ceremonies. We have Snow Snake. Snow Snake is a game, is a competition where there are bets and wagers played. There's winners and losers. It's not just a game of chance. But there is wagering. So, but these specific things, and of course, like I said, witchcraft was also another. But it also placed women in a different role. The Code of Handsome Lake very much adopted the male-dominant society that Christianity also had. And that was a very strong and striking departure from our culture. It condemned women and the behavior of women, and put the behavior of women in a spotlight. And it also tied women more closely to witchcraft than men. Go ahead.
Was the Code of Handsome Lake a European concept?
No, it was Quaker influenced, but it was also influenced by the problems of the day, and so what happened with witchcraft and again I think some of the condemnation of women within this thing was also the ability for men to blame women for some of the problems that existed rather than taking some of the responsibility themselves. But in the midst of this, what I find interesting is the Seneca Nation, in particular, in 1848 would adopt a constitution. Now, the Code of Handsome Lake was still kind of in the upswing. I mean, Handsome Lake passed away in the I want to say like 1813, somewhere, 1814, in that era, around there, maybe a little later than that. Um, but the code actually took on more um, followings and more of a following after his death. So at that time, you have, again, a Quaker influence over the Seneca saying, well, your chief system's not working. And they're right, because it shouldn't have been a chief system. It was supposed to have been a clan system, not a chief system, because the chiefs were being corrupted. In fact, even guys like Handsome Lake and Corn Planter and others were some of the signatories on some of the treaties that were terrible treaties. But so you had this, and this change in Seneca governance, at least within some of the Seneca territories, and you also had the beginnings of the residential school process, which started in the 1800s. So when you consider that dramatic change and the way Native people were fitting in with a dominant culture around them, you understand that there were certain decisions made and there were certain behaviors that our people adopted that were as much geared towards survival as it was to sustaining a culture. And I think that's why I'm not so condemning of even of errant chiefs of that era and that kind of thing, as I am just trying to analyze it as matters of fact and saying, okay, we suffered these consequences of the dominant society around us, and I think that's what that's kind of where I try to spend time, and when we talk about things like beliefs and culture, and even our stories, I try to take it back before and hold it in a perspective. As I teach these things to my children and grandchildren and others, I'm going to spend more time talking about the relationship with nature than I'm going to talk about rising from the dead or stone canoes, across the lake. And I'm not saying, I mean, you can make a stone canoe and paddle across the lake. I don't know why you would, but you can do that. But I think in telling even a story like that, I think you frame it in a way that, the thing that took place, and the reason Hayawenta was such a significant figure in working with the Ganawida, with the peacemaker, was Hayawenta had daughters who were killed, and they were killed at the hands of an Onondaga chief or an Onondaga person or a leader or a significant person who was called Taladaho. Now Taladaho was by all accounts of this time period was an evil man, and he was obsessed with dominating others. Oftentimes the stories neglect to say how he got that way, but regardless, what ends up being told in the stories is that that Taladaho was responsible for the deaths of Hayawenta's daughters. And it was during his grieving process, when he left the Onondaga people and went off on his own, that the Ganawida observed. They observed, he observed the grieving process that Hayawenta was going through. And what Hayawenta began doing was, he was acknowledging his grief. And in acknowledging his grief, he said, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. He said, but if I ever come across anyone who has known grief like I know today, I want to remember what I'm doing now so I can help them through it. So he began stringing shells. And some people associate this with with what would become our use of wampum and wampum belts with this story of Hayawenta. Again, whether it's completely true but it's an example of how this story begins. And what he would do is he would say, I wish somebody would do these things for me. What we come out of that is what we call the first three strings not only of the condolence, but we refer to them the first three strings of the Gayana da Goa, which, and what it refers to is when somebody is depressed or grieving or in pain or somehow suffering an emotional tragedy. Well, we make the reference to the, first off, taking the softest doe skin from the belly of the doe, and the softest skin, and we take that and we wipe the eyes. Because we know when there's a death, that death is like somebody scattering the logs of your fire, and that with that death comes those ashes and embers, and they burn your eyes, and your eyes become filled not just with tears, but with the pain that you're suffering, you are unable to see. So metaphorically and physically, we say we can wipe away the tears. And then we say also that pain can block the ability to hear. So whether it's physically, the embers and the ashes plug up the ears. We say we'll take the seagull's wing, the tip where it comes to a point, and we'll help clean out those ears so they can hear the words of their family. They can hear the birds sing again. They can hear all that is good in life. And then we grab we take the cleanest water that we can find from an underground spring, one that that is cool and soothing and pure, and then we quench that throat and quench that, because we also know that it becomes very difficult to speak when you're in an emotional state. You're so consumed that your throat tightens up. So we refer to those three things, those three strings. We said we will clean the eyes, and we will clean the ears, and we'll clean the throat. So your voice returns, your ability to hear the compassion that others have for you, and your ability to see. So you can hear goodness, see goodness, and speak goodness again. And that is something that is both metaphoric but literal at the same time. The UN passed the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. 4 nations voted against it in 2007. That was the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They were the only 4 nations that voted against it. Now, since then, the United States and Canada, well, actually all 4, have offered some sort of tepid support or endorsement, but they frame it in a way that does things like suggest that they support the aspirations of the document. They also try to redefine what an indigenous person is. The United States says, well, we will decide what an indigenous person is in the United States. And in fact, their definition fits within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that definition is a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States, the exact domination code. They also said that they support the aspirations of the UN Declaration. This is the Obama administration, I might add. Support the aspirations of the Declaration in so much as it does not conflict with U.S. law. So if the United States has a law or a policy or a practice that is in violation of the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, then the United States doesn't support that. It is not really an endorsement. But what I did, especially in light of this, in the preamble of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the third affirmation says, affirming that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. That is about as clear a rebuke of the doctrine of Christian discovery that exists. They don't name it specifically, but clearly it is among the references in that affirmation. The entire world, as far as the United Nations is concerned, has essentially endorsed much of this, if not all of this. Like I said, the United States has had a bit of a tepid response. And I predicted that the Obama administration would have to make some overture to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples because of if for no other reason, because of the strong opposition that the Bush administration had to it. There had to be some sort of response. But I'll tell you, there was a National Security Council document that came out in January as Bill Clinton was leaving office. So it was his administration, and it was that national security paper on indigenous peoples, and it was referenced both the draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an Organization of American States declaration, and one other declaration regarding racism and discrimination. And in that document, they specifically wanted to redefine what self-determination meant. And what they suggested was when the United States uses the word self-determination, they mean internal self-determination. They mean self-determination for things that are not matters of sovereignty. And in fact, they absolutely and distinctly opposed any notion that indigenous peoples could assert sovereignty over their own natural resources, specifically in this document. Now I say that because this comes out of the Clinton administration, holds true through the Bush administration as the premise to vote against the UN DRIP, and then holds true through the Obama administration as the conditions by which the United States does endorse the UN DRIP. So there's things that transcend who's in office, what party's in office, and all that stuff. And I think that's important to note. Now, I wanted to mention, and part of the reason that Stephen Newcomb not only quotes Tecumseh, but also cites Manhattan in this film is for personal reasons. He's Lenape and he's Shawnee, Pawnee. So, but the interesting thing about the Manhattan reference is the Two-Row Wampum Renewal Campaign. That came across as a very celebratory issue, specifically, and the Onondagas played a big role in that campaign. But what it suggested was that there was this great binding relationship that was forged between the Dutch and the Mohawks originally, but the Haudenosaunee as a whole, and suggested that the Dutch were honorable participants in embracing this relationship with the Haudenosaunee as far as the Two-Row Wampum. The Onondagas take the position that the Two-Row Wampum, the first time the Two-Row Wampum or the Gaswanta or the Diohade was offered to Europeans was in 1613 to the Dutch. That may or may not be accurate, but to the extent that it may be, when you realize that only 30 years later, the Dutch would be not massacring Haudenosaunee, but massacring the Lenape, and with such savagery, with such just absolute disregard for not just human life but decency. It argues the case whether the Dutch really ever understood what was being offered to them in the first place by the Haudenosaunee. Virgil Killstrates is right. There was a sense that our people didn't understand the nature of European war and European bloodshed. They didn't understand that. The idea that you could be that vile in terms of killing women and children, and that went from the Spanish, right up until 1890 with the massacre of Wounded Knee. I mean, what people don't realize is one of the first purchases that the United States ever made in terms of a weapon of mass destruction was the Hotchkiss. And it was a gun that was basically developed for mowing down Native people. It wasn't purchased for the Civil War necessarily. It was purchased uh, for shooting fish in a barrel, and that's the way it was used amongst the native people. And it wasn't because our people were primitive or naive. In retrospect, it could look as though we were naive, but some of that is unimaginable. And when I talk about things like intergenerational trauma, the one thing that I would submit to you is to emphasize what was being talked about there. Can you imagine having your entire world, everything that you were ever taught from the oldest people in your community, and be told that it was wrong, that it was a lie, that everything you believed, every part of your culture was wrong, and that not only was wrong, but that it was evil, and that it would have to be replaced, and that it would have to be replaced with another culture that in many ways defied the very things that I talk about here, awareness. It defies so much of what we experience on a daily basis. And I'm not just talking about Christianity, or any faith-based religion. What I'm saying is the dogma and the doctrine that comes with it, and the hierarchy, the sense of superiority and supremacy, the domination. Even any place throughout the rest of the animal kingdom, you would never see another creature whose sole purpose would be to wipe out another species. Now, they might consume some of them, but the idea of wiping out is just unheard of. So again, I give my thanks to Stephen Newcomb for allowing me to share this film with you. I think it is something that you will see again. We're working to not only, I'm trying to help with some of the rollout of this film. So the opportunity for me to come here and not only offer what I've offered, but offer what Stephen Newcomb and his friends. And by the way, I had forgotten that they mentioned the Mankato, Minnesota issue, and it should stand to reason, because the production company is 38+2. It is they did a documentary about this, so it's the reason.
Were they involved in the Dakota 38?
Yes, yeah. Well, not the Dakota 38, but yes, the Dakota 38. They are the production company that did that. Yeah.
Okay,
So
that's online. And
yeah.
I get it.
Go ahead.
Is the document of the rights of indigenous people, has that been applied in other cultures?
This is a UN declaration.
Right.
The problem is as with many UN declarations, it has no real force of law at this point. So it ends up being, again, to borrow a United States expression, an aspirational document. There is, and the work that gets done every year at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is a way to implement this and to figure out a way to give it a better, I don't want to say force, but create forums for addressing the issues here.